Good morning, and I'm going to respect our time and go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for coming to my presentation. You should know that my dogs are in the room and that anytime now my children may roam through, but I have told everyone they must shush. I have sent some links to you in the chat of some resources that I am going to be highlighting. We have 40 minutes for the presentation and then question and answer at the end. And so for your questions, if you would just type question in the chat with your question, I can read those. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name is Ginny Blackson, and I am the Director of Libraries and Media Services at Linville College in McMinnville, Oregon. However, I am broadcasting from my kitchen in Ellensburg, Washington. This was a presentation I had planned for the Oregon Library Association, and unfortunately, as we know, that conference was canceled. And my conference session for Oregon was going to be about the Oregon curriculum, but since the conference got canceled and I am here, I just didn't have time to finish the Oregon one. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about work we did in Washington, and we'll talk at the end sort of how that translates. So I give two presentations. Both are called Core Voices Infusing Indigenous Perspectives. For librarians, I do Infusing Indigenous Perspectives across the collection. And for pre-service teachers and teachers, I do a presentation that's called Infusing Across the Curriculum. And I'm going to talk about across the curriculum today. So Washington State passed a tribal sovereignty curriculum through the state senate, and all K through 12 students are required to have this curriculum delivered to them. I'm going to go back here a little bit and talk about what is unique about since time immemorial. So one of the unique things is that it's an inquiry based. So there are no right or wrong answers. And it's also not generic. So we are not speaking of indigenous people as generic Indians, but we are talking about specific tribes and tribal members. It's also place-based. And so each school district has been matched with the state of Washington. And sometimes the tribe is not who were the dwellers of the ancestral dwellers of where the school might be. And some counties have different tribes listed. And it's inquiry. And it's an integrated curriculum, which means that we don't just study indigenous people the Wednesday before Thanksgiving and never talk about them again. It is meant to be integrated into the curriculum, into social studies. However, I'll make the argument in this presentation that we should go farther than that. So I did not start with an introduction to tell you a little bit about myself and why I find this interesting. So I always like to start with two disclaimers. One is that you will hear me say about 50 times that this is my favorite book, and every book is my favorite book. And so you'll just hear that a lot. The other is that I hold no tribal affiliation. I am not a member of any federally recognized tribe or state recognized tribe. I come to this as an educator and a person who is curious, and also someone who grew up in the ancestral homelands of the Cherokee and Shawnee people and the ancient Mississippian cultures. And I grew up on my grandparents' 120-acre tobacco farm until I was about 12. My grandfather did not plow with a tractor. It was all mule plowing and hand planting. And what that meant is I spent a lot of my life in the dirt. And where I grew up, there were signs of people everywhere, pottery shards, arrowheads. And so from a very young age, I understood that there were people here before my people. Linfield College is located on the traditional homelands of the Yamhill Band of the Kalalampan tribe. And here in Ellensburg, I live on the ancestral lands of the Kittitas Band of the Yakima Nation. So we answer some essential questions with the since time immemorial sovereignty, tribal sovereignty. And it's one of the ways that makes it integrated, is that we're asking some essential questions. And these essential questions are very tied to standards that you'll see in other parts of K through 12 education. How does physical geography affect the distribution, culture, and economic life of local tribes? That is from the geography standards that looks at how physical geography affects distribution, culture, and economic life of people. What is the legal status of tribes who negotiated or who did not negotiate settlement for compensation for the loss of their sovereign homelands? What were the political and economic, cultural forces consequential to the treaties that led to the removal of tribes from long established homelands to reservations? What are the ways in which tribes respond to the threats and outside pressures to extinguish their culture and independence? And what do local tribes do to meet the challenges of reservation life? As sovereign nations, what do local tribes do to meet the economic and cultural needs of their tribal communities? And so this is a modern curriculum. So while there will be historic context, this is about how Indigenous people in the state of Washington live and interact with the federal and state governments. And when teaching this curriculum, it is collaborative with the tribe. And so these are school district related relationships between state and federally recognized tribes. And in Washington, we do have tribes that the state recognizes, but the federal government does not. And so as a librarian, as we look at supporting these kind of curriculum that are coming to states, there are a lot of collection development challenges. And I like to call part of them the 3 O's, that materials are out of date, that materials are out of print, that the content is just outrageous, that it's really about cultural appropriation and not education, and a lack of recognition and scholarship around Indigenous authors. So the first one I like to point out is How to Teach American Indians, a guide for school, library, and media specialists. And this is a seminal work in our field as librarians. And it was last updated in 1995. And a lot of things have happened since 1995. In 1996, Kennewick Man was discovered here in Washington, which led to a large controversy between the Smithsonian and a number of tribes in the Tri-City areas. In 2004, the National Museum of the American Indian was founded. And this book was written before the widespread availability of the internet, before Amazon was established, before Google was established. So a lot of things have happened in our library and educational world that this book does not address. There's also the issue of out of print. So the 1970s was a sort of publishing renaissance about Native Americans and by Native Americans. In this book, They Walked Before the Indians of Washington State by Mrs. Carpenter, who is a member of the Nisqually Nation, was done in 1976 as part of Washington's centennial. And it is, to my knowledge, the only history of Washington written by a member of a Washington tribe. And it's out of print. You can occasionally find it on Amazon for around $350. Most libraries in the state of Washington are removing this from its circulating collections because of its rarity. I did attempt for a while, and I'm still working with a librarian from the Nisqually tribe to try to get permission to digitize this book, because I truly believe it's something that every Washington student and teacher should read. But there are copyright issues. The state of Washington published the book, but they don't hold the copyright. Mrs. Carpenter has passed away. And so really at this point, it's working with her surviving relatives to get permission. But you'll find that a lot of, excuse me, outstanding works were published in the 70s. And you can't get your hands on them anywhere. And outrageous. So this presentation is based on a fellowship that I got, that I'll talk about towards the end, to study at the National Museum of the American Indian and the Vine Deloria Junior Library in Washington, D.C. And I was so excited when I found this book, because I am fascinated with prehistoric life in North America. And so we were super excited when we found this. And then we were really disappointed when we started reading. So in this book, it's clear that tribal people were not involved in the writing of this book. In it is all of the women are portrayed as shrews. All the men are portrayed as weak. And apparently our ancient sisters like to fish topless. I think that's probably the most outrageous, and it's a poor photograph, but it is a photograph from the book. And you know, we see this a lot in anthropology, this sort of sexualization of Indigenous women. And so we were just so disappointed when we found this. And a lot of us have materials in our collection that are this outrageous, or even more so. One of the interesting things about the Vine Deloria Library for the National Museum of the American Indian is that they specifically collect books that are full of racist stereotypes to show how Indigenous people have been portrayed over time. And so I am a catalog surfer of libraries. But what you want to take into account here is that just because it's held by the National Museum of the American Indians Library does not necessarily mean that it is a good resource. In many cases, those things are examples. And then we have to think about that in our own collections, is if we are holding on to these books because they are examples of racist stereotypes, how do we denote that? And a lot of the information is really about cultural appropriation and not about education. We certainly would not dress Clifford the Big Red Dog up as the Pope. That would be culturally inappropriate. And also the use of war bonnets. And war bonnets are sacred objects that are earned. And so it would be sort of like dressing Papa Bear up as a Congressional Medal of Honor winner. Also, that they promote this idea of generic Indians, particularly Plains Indians, and don't really look at the richness and individuality of the cultures. And so collecting Indigenous literature is a lot like tracing breadcrumbs. What I try to do is to look at awards, which we'll talk about, but one of the great resources that I've used for years, I was a high school teacher in Alaska for 7 years. I lived in Alaska for 16 years. And I lived in the homelands of both the Tlingit and the Yupik. And I really struggled to find books that my students could relate to, and I discovered American Indians and Children Literature blog by Deborah Reese. And if you're not reading this blog, you really, really should. She is for a long time the foremost expert in American Indian children's literature. She has two so she does book reviews and recommendations and not recommendations. And so what I say is that if Deborah recommends it, you should absolutely buy it. She has never led me wrong. For her not recommended, Deborah has really stringent guidelines for what she will recommend. And if individuals are not a member of a tribe, sometimes she does not recommend their literature. One of the examples, and I'm sure that all of you get these maps, advertisements for these maps of Native American nations, Native American language maps. And she doesn't recommend these, and I don't recommend them as geographic artifacts because of some of the lack of dates and the misplacement of tribes at different time periods. And so we actually, when I worked at Central Washington University, had a set of these maps, and we had them as artistic interpretation. We also can use awards, and there's a growing number of awards that highlight Native American literature, Indigenous literature. One of the ones that I really love are the First Nation out of Canada. There's also the Victoria Premier Literary Award out of Australia. And the American Indian Library Association, and the American Indian Library Association the American Indian Library Association gives out awards every 2 years. I buy for my library all the award winners as well as all of the nominees. And then it's a real good collection development tool to look at who's won. Let's look at an award from the American Indian Library Association. And so I take a look at who won, and then I go out and look at their other books and who their publishers were, because there are Native American publishing houses and publishing groups. And then I can go and look and see what that publisher offers. I can also look for them in anthologies and see who else is publishing in those anthologies. And then one of my favorites is Indigenous Comic-Con. And this has been going on for about 5 years, maybe 6. And it is held in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And it is comedians, performers, artists, and writers, all of whom are tribally affiliated people. And someday I'm going to get to go. I've never gotten to go, but it's one of my long-term goals. And then we need to ask ourselves, what should we be reading to educate ourselves? And I recommend these 4 books. North American Indians, a very short introduction, and it is a very, very, very short introduction by Theda Purdue and Michael Green, who are a married couple, and both of who were professors, my professors as an undergraduate. And what I learned from Dr. Green and Dr. Purdue and this book is that there were a lot of people on the North and South American continents before contact. We kind of think of small, idyllic villages of a couple of hundred people, and that's just not true. The new estimates for pre-contact population of the Americas, the lowest estimate is 112 million. The highest estimate is 144 million. And to put that into context, in 1492, there were 6 million people in Europe. So there was not a place on this continent that there were not people, from the Arctic to the tip of South America. It also would tell you, I learned about the movement of people. So tribes had to move both because of force and because of pressure. So I am from Central Appalachia. And as Anglos came into Georgia, North Carolina, those coastal areas, they began to push the Cherokee northwest. And so the Cherokee came up into what is now Kentucky and pushed the Shawnee out of Kentucky up into Indiana, where they absorbed smaller tribes. And so there was a mass movement of people. For example, we consider the Sioux as sort of the archetypes of Plains Indians, but in fact, they were northern woodland tribes that got pushed onto the plains. Lots and lots of tribes got pushed onto the plains, and the problem with that was that there were people already there. And so this caused a great deal of conflict among tribes in the plains. And we'll talk a little bit about Dances with Wolves later when I talk about another book. But, you know, one of the things is that many of the movies that we've seen hold up Plains Indians as the archetype of Native people, and they fail to explore why there was such large conflict. And there was such large conflict because there were lots and lots of people there, and all of a sudden, thousands of other indigenous people from Minnesota and Wisconsin and those areas bordering the plains got pushed in. The second one is Vine Deloria Juniors, Indians of the Pacific Northwest. And yes, that is the library that I studied at. Vine Deloria was actually a Sioux, member of the Sioux Nation. And but he taught in Western Washington for many years. And it is Indians of the Pacific Northwest from the coming of the white man to present day. And present day in this book ends in the 70s with the fishing wars. And what I can warn you about this book is that once you read Vine Deloria, other things pale in comparison. I use this book with high school students in Alaska. I used it with college students in Washington. It's so beautifully written, and you'll be disappointed in other things as you read this because it's very accessible. It's not a thick academic tome with 30 pages of footnotes. It's in very clear language, and it is definitely not an unbiased perspective. That Vine Deloria tells this from the perspective of Indigenous people. Once you read this, then you're going to have to read God is Dead, or God is Red. You're going to have to read Custer Died for Our Sins. Vine Deloria is just a fabulous, fabulous author. The next book is Nation to Nation, Treaties Between the United States of America and American Indian Nations. And this is a Smithsonian production. a book, but there were lots of people from Washington State involved in it. And kind of the highlights of the book is that it goes into the Medicine Creek Treaty, which was the major treaty of Washington, and the Bolt decision, which was the Supreme Court decision that mainly focused on fishing rights. And that came out of the fishing wars of the 1970s. And then, do all Indians live in teepees? And this is a question and answer book from the National Museum of the American Indian. And it's just a beautiful book. It has great illustrations. It's well written, and it has beautiful, beautiful white space. And so these are books that I recommend that educators in Washington read to get a full understanding of the diversity and richness of tribal history. And then we all have to confront our own racism and prejudice. I'm the first person to admit that I try hard, but I do have prejudice. Our prejudice comes from how and when we were raised and how we've lived our lives. But we need to address our own racism and the racism that that covers our conversations about Indigenous people. And so the first book is a book called Sweetgrass Basket, and it's about two Mohawk sisters who are sent to residential schools. It's written by Marilyn Carville. She is not a tribal person. She is married to a member of the Mohawk tribe, and this book was written with his aunties about their experience. And it's told in verse, because one of the things we have to do when we talk about racism is talk about it in a way that doesn't get people's hackles up so much that we cannot have the conversation. And so books in verse are a little gentler. And then, of course, Sherman Alexi's The Absolute True Diary of a Part-Time Indian, which is the funniest book about racism ever. Now, as you know, may or may not know, Sherman is a controversial figure, and he actually had his award taken away from the American Indian Library Association, which was completely in their purview. All that being said, we have to sometimes separate the work from the person, and it's a phenomenal work. Both look at racism and education. Both look at the effects of multi-generational racism. I have never given The Absolute True Diary of a Part-Time Indian to a student, a patron that didn't love it. Now, it does get challenged quite a bit, and it shows up on the ALA Challenge books. It particularly gets challenged in Washington because it takes place in Washington and is about Sherman is a member of the Spokane Nation. And so it has a sentence about masturbation in it, and that's usually what gets people's hackles up, although it addresses racism in education and racism in the world. But it's one that I recommend that educators read. And why do I ask you to read these things? Because stories have power, and in particularly, stories have, who gets to tell the story has a great deal of power. So I'm going to show you this short video, hopefully. Can I get a hands up if people can see this?
It'd be busy, busy, busy all through the day. You get up and you just go right to work, right to work.
There was always something to do. There was never any idle time. The only idle time we had was after we eat and before we go to bed.
One of the older people would be just relaxing, laying down there and saying, it'd be really nice to hear a story. And then just organically, someone would just start telling the story.
Storytelling for the Nupiaq people is very important because it not only created that sense of community, but is a way to pass on wisdom to the next generation.
It was like TV, you know? It was just like, it was as good as anything, any movie you've ever seen. And the storyteller told it so clearly that it was just as powerful as any of the greatest movie blockbusters you've ever seen.
There was a reason behind the stories that we were told because they held traditional knowledge. They held things that we might need to know in life, whether it was about how to find food or how to survive, or it was about well-being and the importance of connecting with people and being a good member of the community.
We all do stories. We all live in stories. We all tell stories to our friends, and they need to be told. They need to be heard.
So no worries, I am supplying you a link to that video, but these are members of, these are Inupiat people from Northern Alaska. And I'm going to show you where this all came from. They did a great video game called Never Alone. And it is set in the Arctic as a way of cultural transmission. And so who gets to tell the story is very important. And so we want to look at Indigenous views of history. One of my favorite authors is Joseph Brochot. Never wrote a bad book. And it's about code talkers. And so when I was a teacher and we studied World War II, this was one of my reading options. We all are probably pretty familiar with the Navajo code talkers from the movie, but there were actually code talkers from many tribes. And these individuals wrote code based on their Indigenous language, and none of those codes were ever broken by the Germans. So highly, highly skilled. The Great Death by John Smelser is about the Spanish influenza epidemic in Alaska, very kind of timely. I will give you a warning about John. So John is Athabascan, and he is from Alaska. And he and Deborah Reese have been in sort of a, who does the American Indian Children's Literature blog, have been in quite the fight argument for the last couple of years about whether or not he's really a Native author. I love John Smelser's books. I use them extensively as an educator, and I've met John Smelser's grandmother, who is an Athabascan elder, and you know that's good enough for me. But I have different criteria. But this is about two young women who everyone in their village dies, and they have to walk out to find people. And it starts with a great line of, "The great death came upriver with a white man with wild red hair and big red spots." And the influenza epidemic of the last century had devastating effects on Indigenous people everywhere. It ran through the residential schools like crazy. I worked for Sheldon Jackson College in Alaska, which used to be a residential school, and we actually had a graveyard specifically for the children and teachers who died. And so it's a really, really good book. It's short. John makes beautiful books that are meant for quick reads and wonderful reads. Between Two Fires, which is about American Indians during the Civil War. It's a nonfiction book. Tribes had supported both the Confederacy and the Union. And there were actually whole regiments of Indigenous people. Like a Hurricane is a collection of short essays on the American Indian movement of the 1970s, but that still does exist today. Today, the American Indian movement is very involved in the epidemic of missing Native women, as well as racism in sports. Two Leggings, A Making of a Crow Indian, is one that Dr. Green had me read in college. And it is the autobiography written with an Anglo of a Crow warrior from the 19th century. And that's when I always bring up Dances with Wolves, because in Dances with Wolves, the Crows are the bad people. And so it's a kind of look at the life of this young man before he was sent to a reservation. Aleutian Sparrow is also a great book. Miss Hesse is not an Indigenous person, but she is a well-researched historic writer. This book, again, is written in verse, and it's about the forced removal of the Aleutian people during World War I, during World War II. During World War II, the U.S. Navy went to the Aleutian Islands. They packed everybody up that lived there. No one was allowed to remain. They put them on boats and took them to Southeast Alaska and dropped them off at abandoned canneries to live in. And when the war was over and people went home, because their homes had been used as a military barracks, their homes were pretty much destroyed. And I see a lot of chat, and I just want to let you know that one of the links, and I'll go back to it at the end, has all of this on it. So you don't have to keep track of every book I talk about. I know it's kind of hard. And then Mary Crow Dog, Lakota Woman. And I use this a lot with teen girls. Mary Crow Dog is Sioux. She was at one point married to Leonard Crow Dog, who is the chief medicine man of the Pine Ridge Reservation. It looks at her experience through residential school, of being a young mother. She gave birth during the siege of Wounded Knee by the American Indian Movement. And so just a wonderful, wonderful book. And we can look beyond history to look at how modern issues affect tribal people. And so these are some of my favorite books I used in high school. Who Will Tell My Brother, again, by Marlene Colville. And it's about racism in sports and burning effigies of Native Americans during sporting events. This takes place during the Vietnam War. And it's a young man who's writing to his brother who's serving in Vietnam, and the racism that he experiences as a young Native boy, but also the racism he feels every day because of the school mascot. I use this both in civil rights units and units about Vietnam. Offsides is by Erica Eccleston, who is also not a Native author, but collaborated with the Mohawk tribe to write this, and it's about soccer. And it's about a Native student athlete who is on a team that has a derogatory Native mascot and how he feels about that. Miss Florence is one of my favorite new authors, and she just wrote this great book called The Missing. For those of you who don't know, in Canada in particularly, there are thousands, tens of thousands of missing Native women, as there are in the United States. No one really looks for them. As fracking has become more popular in the US, in Minnesota and Wisconsin and South Dakota, and we see these large transient populations come in, the number of missing Indigenous women and children is rising. And so she wrote this book, and it's a young woman whose best friend has gone missing. And rather than looking for her, local law enforcement just decides that the brother is guilty. And then Cynthia Smith, who is, and I'm going to forget her tribal affiliation, I'm sorry, but she's from Minnesota, and she's wrote many great books.
I'm proud of the work we do and the space we built.
I'm sorry,
but the thing I'm most proud of is the community of people We're a nonprofit comedy theater.
Have no idea why that just started on my computer. Oh, because I let the Vimo. Sorry. We'll go back to sharing our screen here. And she writes some great children's books. She wrote a great one called Jingle Bells about traditional dancing. But this is Rain Is Not My Indian Name, that is about a young woman who is urban and indigenous and white enough to pass. And so it's about that walking on the edge. And then The Trap by John Schmelzer, again, another fabulous, fabulous book. It takes place in rural Alaska. The young character is finishing his bachelor's degree from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, correspondence, and he works at the post office, and the elder women love for him to read to them about American history so that they can laugh. But also it looks at intergenerational alcoholism and also that fine line between supporting an elder and making decisions for an elder. One Night is about the convergence of racism and sexual violence. So it's about two sisters who go to a party in which one of them is drugged and raped, and then is labeled an Indian slut in her school. And most of the book is about her trying to hide her pregnancy from her parents. And My Name Is Not Easy by Deborah Edwardson, again, not an indigenous author, but married to an Inupiat man, and this is about his experience at residential school. And then it's a great time for graphic novels. Red is a Haida manga that's fabulous. Super Indian is a really, really, really cool book because it's a Native American superhero, but then in each book she has let's meet a real Native American history superhero, and she'll do short biographies. Sugar Falls and 7 Generations is by a First Nation member in Canada. His work looks at intergenerational alcoholism and violence, and Sugar Falls looks at residential school. And then The Strong Man is a great one, the young man with the ponytail that I showed you in that video. Ishmael Hope is one of the authors, and it takes a traditional Tlingit fable and puts it in a modern context. We can also look at making sure that we include Indigenous perspectives when we talk about the environment and sustainability. This is a great book called Native Defenders of the Earth. A Tribal Approach to Salmon Recovery, which is done by the Mid-Columbian Tribal Alliance. And The Last Days of Shishmaref, which is a great movie, but I will warn you, it's Dutch and it goes super slow, but it's about the island of Shishmaref, Alaska. That's residents are the first American climate refugees because of global warming. They had to abandon their ancestral homeland on this island and move to the mainland. And then Trickster, which is a graphic novel that is a collection of Native American trickster stories. And the great thing about it is the art really shows how mythology and cosmology developed in response to the natural environment. I'm not going to have time to show you this, but I'll give you a link, and that's, the changing Arctic is very, very important. And so the video I showed you before is of the individuals who created this video game called Never Alone. And Never Alone is an Arctic adventure that has characters culturally from the culture, and a little girl and her fox who run around the Arctic and have adventures. And then the Smithsonian Curriculum. So the Smithsonian National Museum of American Indians does a lot of curriculum, and specifically for the Pacific Northwest, there's the American Indian response to environmental challenges, and you'll see that the Lomi are featured. And it's all of the tribes are, who are we? Where do we live? What is our challenge? how are we meeting that challenge? So it's not a curriculum of victimization, but a curriculum of empowerment. And then their new one is about the fishing wars. And it's a great curriculum. And I put a link in the chat to both of those. And then I just want to bring it to the end of all of my research was made possible by the Smithsonian Libraries. The Smithsonian has 27 libraries. I was awarded what's called the Neville-Pribram mid-career educators, and it goes around to each Smithsonian library. And so I think next year is going to be the Museum of Natural History. And finally, just to bring it, I did the Smithsonian Challenge when I was there. And one of those was to take a picture in every Smithsonian museum in DC, and I did that. And for those of you that don't know what that is behind me, that is the Parliament Funkadelic Mothership. That is in the National Museum of the American Indian, and that was just super cool. So I have provided in the chat some links because I know that you're just not going to remember everything I said. I'm going to end my screen share here. Stop share. So you'll notice in the chat links, there is a link to a Central Washington University LibGuide, and that was the curriculum that what I used to teach pre-service teachers. So there's links to everything I've talked about on that site pretty much. And then my new site LibGuide that I'm working on for Linfield College about Oregon, and I'm working on that. I also did one for a link to the fishing wars and a link to the environmental change. And I know I've totally gone over because when I talk about books, I can't stop. But let's see. I'm going to put the links because people are saying they're not seeing them. I'm going to copy them and paste them one more time, which means I only left time about 3 minutes for questions, and I'm sorry about that. There we go. And so I just posted them again. So we have 3 minutes for questions. And so I am happy. It says, let's see, this presentation is being recorded and can be found. So are there any quick questions? And I'm so sorry that we went over. So one of the questions is, where will we find the link for the video and video game? It is on the Central Washington University guide. And the great thing about that game is that they did a whole group of interviews and oral histories. So there's lots and lots of stuff to help with that. And there's 2 games. There's Never Alone and there's Foxtail. They're about $12 each, and they're just fantastic. I'm just going to chat. Recommendations for the elementary level. I recommend that you go to Deborah Reese's website. My area is really young adult and post-secondary. But if you go to the American Indian Library Association, they have all of their current and past winners, and they have an outstanding elementary collection. I'm just looking through here. Oh yeah, fry bread. The joke in my household is that's how my husband knew I was pregnant both times, is I woke up in the morning and said, let's go get some fry bread. Okay, we're at the end of our session. If there's no more questions, please feel free to email me, and I'm going to put my and I really want to encourage librarians to look at Smithsonian Library Fellowships. I held out on the the Neville-Pribram for the National Museum of the American Indian because I felt like a tribal person should take that. But what they had were applications of all postdoctorate folks. And again, they gave me a stipend that paid for my room and board and my travel. And it was just an incredible experience. You'll often hear people say it must be great to be a librarian and get to read all day. I got to read all day for 6 weeks. That was my job, was to visit Smithsonian institutions and read. And I'm saving up for when the assistantship or the fellowship is at the library in Panama, because I want to do that when I've just got to figure out what curriculum I would work on. So thank you, everyone. Oh, well, we've got a couple of minutes left. Are there any other questions, comments? People have given some good resources here. I am going to do a presentation on the Oregon curriculum at the next OLA. And I see somebody has a very cute dog. Okay, it looks like we're all done. But please feel free to contact me. Please use those resources. Please send me recommendations. I did leave one thing out of the presentation, and that is that when you're looking at books about Indigenous people, written by non-Indigenous people, make sure that you look at the thank yous and the forwards. You want to make sure that the author has collaborated with an elder or a tribe. In the perfect world, we would have hundreds, thousands of Indigenous authored materials to add to our library. Since that's not the case, we want to make sure that what we put in is the best quality. And we're all done now, it looks like, because I think this went, yeah. Everyone have a great day. Hang in there. Quarantine will be over soon.